بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So today's webinar brought to you by a combination of a partnership of Khalil Center and ISNA is the third out of a four-part series focusing on mental health, which in May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so with that, we at Khalil Center teamed up with the ISNA to try to provide some key and important themes and topics regarding mental health that particularly affect our community. So my topic for today is on resiliency and coping. And before I really outline what resiliency is and offer some coping mechanisms or ways of coping with trials and tribulations, I want to build the context. I want to, first of all, talk about why this is important and our current socio-psychological context in this country, as well as, specifically the American Muslim community, before we get into understanding resilience and what it is and why it's actually relevant to us, okay? So first of all, in this country, we want to look at whether misery is increasing or not. So the idea of contentment and happiness, are people happier in this country or not? Well, oftentimes there's this assumption, and it's part of the American dream and today's kind of materialistic world and values, that the more materials you have, the greater happiness and contentment that you will have. Even though a lot of the times we hear this, that materialism is actually not good and it doesn't necessarily bring more happiness, I don't know if we necessarily believe it, because even in our Islamic tradition, we have this concept. For example, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, حُبُّكَ الشَّيْءَ يُعْمِي وَيُصِمْ حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا رَأْسُ كُلِّ خَطِيئَةٍ عفوا. So excuse me, I was just trying to fix the screen. Okay. I'm just going to try to share my screen again, because I think we may have had a problem. Okay, alhamdulillah, now we're back in action. I apologize about that delay. I just wanted to make sure that you guys can all see my PowerPoint screen, and I think that we had a little bit of a challenge with that. Okay, So Islamically, we know that a love of the dunya is the root of all sins and the root of all problems. And though we know that theologically, and in the society, even in popular culture now, they're talking about materialism and how it does not contribute to psychological well-being or contentment. The popular press and culture and media and movies and Hollywood, Bollywood, all of these things would generally have us believe the contrary. And so, first of all, we want to look at that. Materialistically, what's happening? Well, since the 60s, we're actually twice as rich, at least in this country, as those individuals in the 60s. What else has occurred since the 60s to today? In addition to wealth going up, what we're also finding is that psychological stability and well-being is actually on the decline. So, for example, we have doubled the divorce rate, tripled teen suicide rate, quadrupled reported violent crimes, 6 times increase in our prison populations, 6 times increase in babies born to unmarried parents, and teenage pregnancies. We know about this, and 7-fold increase in cohabitation, people living together prior to getting married, which is actually a predictor of future divorce. So the idea that we're actually feeling more content and happier due to materialism is actually not necessarily the case. We are the richest country in the world, the economic superpower of the world, the highest GDP, but yet at the same time, we're also finding that we are also the most miserable, the saddest and anxious people in the world. So let's take a look at depression studies, for example. We find that 1 in 4 people will have depression in their lifetime. That's a pretty high number in this country. And it has been increasing worldwide due to also the influence of American globalization and American culture and the American materialism that's kind of spreading throughout the world. And antidepressants are among the most commonly prescribed drugs, and it's actually one of the leading diagnoses and causes of concern in the healthcare industry. Let's take a look at American Muslims, because oftentimes we might think, well, American Muslims are actually doing a lot better than the average. And we as Muslims are protected from these sorts of things because we have such a wonderful sacred tradition. The reality is, yes, we do have a wonderful sacred tradition, but to what extent are we also influenced by the American, American materialism and the materialistic culture? Probably a lot. Having said that, we also want to look at the Muslim mental health research. So American Muslims actually show that they're actually less happy than the average American for reasons which is probably another presentation for a different day, because American Muslims can be less happier due to a number of factors. Part of it includes immigration and refugee status and coming from war-torn countries, etc., discrimination and all of that. Having said that, American Muslims are actually less happier than the average American, according to a Pew study. And American Muslims show similar anxiety rates to the average American, which is about 18% of the population, which is pretty high. Now, to again reinforce the idea of the point that I'm making here, is that as we can see through the 60s into the 2000s, the ideals and what's important to people, being very financially well off, has increased. The desire to have more wealth has increased in people. So even though we have twice as much access to resources and advances in monetary and materialistic wealth, people are wanting more of it. And we're actually finding that people in the 60s, almost 90% of individuals said that it was important for them to have a meaningful life, a meaningful life philosophy. And that, unfortunately, has been tremendously on the decline. So we can see a huge value shift that has taken place from the 60s into the 2000s. And we're also seeing a relationship between the decreasing materialism and increasing psychological distress at the same time. What else are we finding? Well, we're finding, I mean, before religious affiliation actually was very high in the 60s. And people who tend to have religious affiliation and tend to belong to a faith-based community tend to do a lot better in terms of their contentment, their psychological well-being, their satisfaction with life. They actually have more meaningful relationships, more psychological supports, a sense of community, all of the things that we like in psychology to try to give individuals so that they will increase their resiliency, increase their psychological well-being. And we're finding the contrary of individuals on my second point here, if you notice. Psychological and physical difficulties are, people experience psychological and physical difficulties for those individuals who hold materialistic values. And we're finding that religious affiliation is at its lowest point since the 30s in this country. And we're also finding that's also the case for American Muslims as well, because we're finding that American Muslims are also increasing in the things that we mentioned earlier: alcoholism, tobacco use, gambling, marijuana, illicit drugs, and premarital sex, which is also very high in the American Muslim community as well. Just to reinforce the data that I'm providing thus far, that American Muslims, collection of a sample of 60,000 American Muslims in 2007 showed the following data: that 63% of American Muslims say there's no conflict between being a devout believer and living in a modern society. So living in a world that's highly materialistic, many Muslims don't see a problem with this. In fact, we're finding a lot of immigration trends among Muslims from Muslim countries over to this part of the world is really in seeking material gains. 43% of new arrivals say that they should adopt American customs, so just fall right into the American dream and the illusion of American materialism that is supposed to be a formula for personal satisfaction, psychological well-being, and contentment and happiness. 62% of Muslims say that it's okay to marry a non-Muslim. 43% of American Muslim women wear hijab. That's less than half of people. And by the way, this is ever in their life, meaning that we're not talking about people that wear it all the time. The people that do wear it, we're talking about even if people wear it in the masjid. So no judgment here, but the idea is that religious affiliation among American Muslims is quite surprisingly low. Personal meaning and happiness. So now, thus far, I've been building this connection between increasing materialism and decreasing personal satisfaction, psychological well-being, and generally physical well-being even as well. And so what's the contrary then? Well, the contrary is that if you do have a meaningful life, and there's a lot of this new research, Martin Seligman heads a lot of this research in positive psychology, in discussion of a happiness framework, talking about how personal meaning is really connected to contentment and happiness. And in order for a person to really have true and real happiness, not fleeting temporary happiness, but real contentment, they need to live beyond just materialism. Because materialism provides some sense of satisfaction in the short term. So a person, for example, buys a new car. Well, they're happy for a little while, but after a little while, they get used to that. It's just human nature. They get accustomed to that. And then what they're doing is then they're again seeking the new high. So after a new car, maybe they're seeking a new house, or they're seeking greater goods in life. And that itself is sort of this illusion. You know, the dunya in the Quran is called mata'ul ghurur. It is commodities that is a ghurur. It's deceptive. It's like the Arabic linguists say that when you get closer to it, it's like a person in a desert when they think they're getting close to a well or a bank of water, they get closer, but it's actually an illusion. It's a mirage. It's a delusion that it's actually not there. So individuals feel a sense of pleasure, and Martin Seligman says that human beings do need to have some joy in their life. So it's not about negating all materialism altogether. People need to have hobbies. People need to do things that they're excited about, sports and certain hobbies and certain materials that they want to acquire. There's no problem with that. But that's one stage, and unfortunately most people stay stuck in that stage. In fact, one of the mashayikh talk about how the human beings are made up of two components. One is the jasad and the ruh. The jasad is the physical being of the human being. The ruh is the spiritual essence. The jasad is the physical being that was created from the earth. We were made from turab. We're Bani Adam. We are made from the children of Adam, and we are turab. We are dust. We are made from the earth. Okay, Allah fashioned us from the dirt. And in order for us to survive in our physical being, we need earthly things. We need food, clothing, shelter, materials in this world. However, in order for us to feel satisfaction and contentment, there's the ruh, and the ruh has been made from a divine source. Allah Ta'ala blew this essence, non-material essence into our being, into our body, and gave it life, and gave it purpose and meaning. And it is of a divine source, and therefore, in order to feel true satisfaction, a person needs a divine source. It needs dhikrullah. It needs a remembrance of God. It needs spirituality. It needs God. It needs Allah Ta'ala. And just as the Quran mentions, أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ, that verily it is with the dhikr of Allah that the hearts do find true tranquility and they find rest. And in another place in the Quran, Allah Ta'ala says, فَوَيْلٌ لِلْقَاسِيَةِ قُلُوبُهُم مِّن ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, that woe be upon those individuals whose hearts have become hard, qasiyah. They've become hard, empty, rock-like from the absence of dhikr, that they don't make dhikrullah. And so the absence of the remembrance of dhikrullah creates this hard heart. And what it engenders is a lack of satisfaction and contentment, and this void in the world, which actually existential psychologists and evolutionary psychologists have actually acknowledged today, that human beings naturally have a God concept, and it is pre-wired into our very nature, and it is a part of our essence that we do need God. It is adaptive and functional and necessary to our survival to have the sense of spirituality and God in our lives. So Martin Seligman says, then after pleasure, we need passion and engagement, meaning that you recognize your talents and skill set, and you engage in occupations and things that preoccupy your 9-to-5 schedule every day. That you go to work and you have passion, you're engaged, you love what you do, and it consolidates your talents. Because if you're an individual and you're working in a job that you absolutely hate or you've been forced to do, then that's not useful for your psychological well-being. Additionally, beyond that, Martin Seligman says that in positive psychology, you need to live beyond yourself, bigger than just self, bigger than life. There has to be some higher order meaning and some connection with something beyond yourself. And in fact, in positive psychology, there's this discussion of altruism, living for beyond oneself and living for others, doing things for others, actually. And if you think about it from an Islamic perspective, not doing for goodness sake solely and only, but doing for Allah's sake, for God's sake. That's even a higher latitude or plateau to be able to reach in order to feel true contentment and satisfaction. So further proof, spirituality among Muslims proves that when it's isolated away from physical functioning and social supports and meaning of life, that spirituality and religious coping in and of itself is a positive contributor to positive mental health, psychological well-being. Students, unfortunately, are not very resilient today. And by resilience, I'm going to define it. In a nutshell, resiliency is an ability, is an individual's ability to handle the stressors and dysfunction and challenges of life, that they have psychological resources. It's, for example, a person who has physical resiliency against physical dysfunction or maladies or sicknesses, physical sicknesses, is an individual who might eat right, who might exercise, who might have good exercise, have good genes. All of these things, these produce resiliency against physical dysfunction. And similarly, there are variables psychologically that produce resiliency against the normative challenges and struggles of day-to-day life. So we're finding, again, like the 60s decline, people are lacking a sense of personal well-being, and college students are increasing in their sense of materialism, and they're lacking resiliency. Students are unfortunately not going to college to get an education and to unlock their minds. And oftentimes, historically, people would go to school to unlock their souls, because to know and knowledge was power, and to get closer to Allah and to get closer to God. Unfortunately, it's turned away from education to, the reality is, to training. What we're doing is we're training individuals for vocations. It's vocational training as opposed to education. And this is the unfortunate decline, because students are going to school to get trained, to get a job, and then to be able to make money. And unfortunately, that doesn't produce psychological resiliency. It does not produce happiness or contentment. People can be very educated and smart, but yet have no conception of why they're on this face of this planet. In fact, I was at a conference or at a workshop with Sheikh Hashim, which you can actually find the audios for online at Noor Institute in California. We had a 3-day Islamic holistic well-being kind of workshop, and he talked about how one of his cousins, he had actually, Sheikh Hashim is an early convert to Islam. How one of his cousins went to Harvard University, had I believe a doctorate from there. After they graduated, Sheikh Hashim asked him, "What is it that you want to do with your life? Now what?" And what's the purpose of your life? What was the purpose of all this education? And he was like, well, I'm going to get a job and make some money. He was like, that's all? What is the purpose, just to do that? And he was like, yeah, basically, yes. And he asked, well, what is the purpose of life? What is it beyond that? And it kind of hit him, and he said, I don't know. I've never really thought about that. And it was really a shocker and surprise that individuals are not thinking about higher order life and meaning, but rather the acquisition and the hoarding of material wealth. So now let's say why? Well, why should we live for a higher order purpose? Why should we live for social well-being and psychological well-being? Well, the reality is that it does actually increase, ironically enough, your materialistic well-being as well, in addition to psychological well-being. So a growing body of literature is suggesting that deliberate and comprehensive approaches to teaching children social and emotional skills can actually raise their grades, their test scores, bolster their enthusiasm for well-being, for learning, Actually, there's additional research to show that they actually get better jobs, that they do better in their relationships, they have better marriages. So actually it does contribute to their overall well-being, and it reduces their behavioral problems. It increases their brain's cognitive well-being, or their brain's cognitive functioning and resources. In fact, better predictor than focusing on academics and academics alone. Positive psychology has begun to move in the direction of really focusing on teaching resiliency skills and positive psychology and socio-emotional wellness in the school setting. This has become a new trend because we're discovering that just focusing on academic skills is not, is not sufficient, or is not a good enough way of producing successful human beings in the future. And we know this from the Prophet ﷺ. So if we don't have psychological, motivation, we definitely have religious motivation for this. And that is that the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمِ الْأَخْلَاقِ, that verily I was sent to perfect good character. In a lot of actually literature, like Abu Ali ibn Miskawi, Ghazali, Razi, Kindi, a lot of these predecessors, Avicenna or Ibn Sina, have these risalas, these books on character formation, on the acquisition of virtues and traits, because being able to be a full-fledged, competent human being that has a good akhlaq and good character was imperative to the formation of the human psyche and human behavior and human character. Unfortunately, today, that's not necessarily been the case. The push in psychology, in modern psychology, has been to be symptom-free and to not have psychological distress, and the focus has been the chase after happiness and material well-being, which unfortunately is a paradigm that is designed for failure. Just as the Prophet ﷺ prophesied, أَخَافُ أَن تُفْتَحَ عَلَيْكُمُ الدُّنْيَا, that I fear for you that the world and its treasures will be opened up to you. كَمَا فُتِحَتْ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, just as it was opened up for the people preceding you, your predecessors. وَتُهْلِكَكُمْ كَمَا أَهْلَكَتْهُمْ, and that it will destroy you just like it destroyed individuals that came before you. So what is resiliency? Here's the definition that we have. Resiliency refers to a set of skills and characteristics that allows individuals to adjust and cope effectively with life's challenges. It's being able to cope with the trials and tribulations of life. From an Islamic perspective, what it's built into the tradition. ألم ترى كيف ضرب الله مثلا كلمة طيبة كشجرة طيبة أصلها ثابت وفرعها في السماء. That have you not seen how Allah strikes a parable between kalima طيبة, and the tafsir of this is the kalima la ilaha illallah, your faith, Islam, your belief in Islam, and how it's similar to كشجرة طيبة, just as it is similar to a solid and nutritious and wholesome tree, that its roots are firm. أصلها ثابت. The roots are firmly established in the ground and healthy and has all of the macronutrients. وفرعها في السماء. And its furu', its branches reach towards the sky. It bears fruit. It's green. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. Similarly, in our tradition, this focus on building spirituality and tarbiyah, right, is a mechanism for building resiliency. It's being able to think of the world through the lens of a God compass, of a God lens. Why did trials and tribulations occur? Maybe there's khair and good in trials and tribulations that I didn't consider before. My behaviors of salah, my dhikr and spirituality, all of these things, if they are in place, they will produce spiritual well-being and psychological well-being, and it will produce resiliency against the challenges of life, because when you're met with those challenges, you can say Alhamdulillah ala kulli hal, that praise be to Allah upon for every state. Additional results. What about resilient people? Resilient people are less likely to become depressed. They're less likely to become helpless, more likely to persist in problem solving. They're willing to take good risks and more likely to reach appropriate psychological milestones. What are the risk factors against resiliency? People who are not resilient. What are the variables and things that are characteristic to them? Well, they have greater anxiety, they have low self-esteem, they have academic failure, they don't have good academic coping strategies, they're emotionally dysregulated, and they have poor social skills. These are the internal variables. So if we can work on rectifying these internal variables, then we can begin to produce psychological resiliency. What are environmental variables that make people at risk for psychological distress? Well, unclear boundaries in their relationships early on, so they don't have good parental environments that have good boundaries. They have an exposure to early violence, so individuals who are in war-torn countries or in inner cities where there's an abundance of violence, that's not a good variable for producing psychological stability. They have poor peer association, so they don't have good nurturing friendships. Poverty, they might have family distress and instability. So let's take a look at the opposite. What are protective variables then? What protects individuals against psychological dysfunction and gives them appropriate resources to deal with the challenges of life? Here are the internal variables. Optimism. They have good emotional awareness. They're flexible in their thinking. They have good self-confidence and self-esteem. They have spirituality, and they have good positive religious coping mechanisms. This is to be contrasted with negative coping mechanisms, meaning that negative religious coping mechanisms are those things like individuals say, near the end of life, oh my God, I'm going to be punished by God. And they start thinking fatalistically, and they don't think about the mercy of Allah. So for example, in our tradition, the Islamic tradition, at the end of life, and I teach our chaplains this, end of life kind of care, you're supposed to induce positive religious coping. You're supposed to get them to focus on hope and the hope of the mercy of Allah. And that is supposed to create happiness. In fact, in the Quran it mentions this. إِنَّا إِذَا أَذَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنَّا رَحْمَةً فَرِحَ بِهَا. That when we give human beings a taste of mercy and from us, from Allah Ta'ala, then they become very happy with it. They become positive. They think positive. They feel good about it. What are environmental variables? Meaningful connection to adults. They set realistically high expectations, and they have stable and consistent environments. Now, let me help you build the optimism. So we're going to do some of this. Optimism. So existential psychologists find that individuals who are most happiest with life and who have less anxiety in life are those individuals who have actually accepted that life is going to have anxieties and challenges with it. Individuals who believe that they should have a comfortable lifestyle actually don't do very well in life. They, in fact, have more risk factors because they're not because they have unrealistic expectations of life, and they think that they should feel comfortable. In fact, you see this a lot. You see that sometimes Americans or individuals who have been raised in very well-to-do nations or environments where they are very well off, when they go to third world countries or they go to places or spaces where they don't have their comforts, they have a very difficult time functioning in that setting. They have a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustrations. Okay, so I'll give you the story of, for example, when I was in Turkey, and they may have improved some of this, but earlier on, you know, the concept of crosswalks, there's very few and far between. And when I was there, most people, what they do is they just kind of jaywalk across the road. You have to gauge the traffic and you just walk across. So this British family was there and they were just like kind of sitting off on the side, and they seemed puzzled by the traffic. So one of them saw me walking by and they said, "Excuse me, do you speak any English?" And I said, "Yes." And they had a sigh of relief. "Oh, phew, somebody who speaks English. Can you help us out with something? Can I ask you a question?" I was like, "Yeah, go for it." And they were like, "How do we get across the street? There's no crosswalks." And I never thought about this before because I was just accustomed to just walking across the street. So then I looked at them and I was like, "Are you serious?" And they're like, "Yeah, how do we get across the street? Because we've been waiting on the side of the street for about half an hour trying to figure out where the crosswalks are, and the cars are not really slowing down." I said, wow. It never dawned upon me that they're accustomed to order, which is good in Britain, but they weren't able to function in that environment, in that setting. And I was like, well, you really just have to gauge the traffic and just kind of walk across. And they're like, "So there's no traffic stop walks or there's no way to slow down the traffic?" I said, "No." They were like, "Wow, okay." And they went back to try to strategize how to go across. And I asked them, "Just follow me." And they did. But this is an example of when you don't go through some difficulties, you don't have the opportunity to experience resiliency. In fact, you might find yourself in situations and positions where you're highly distressed over things that you weren't prepared for, because you never were exposed to those settings. And you know, in the Quran, it mentioned this. أَحَسِبَ النَّاسُ أَن يُتْرَكُوا أَن يَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَهُمْ لَا يُفْتَنُونَ. So Allah's preparing our minds to expect challenges. Allah says, do individuals think that they're going to say La ilaha illallah, they're going to be Muslim, but they're just going to be left alone and they're never going to be tried or tested? So part of optimism is being able to think positively about trials and tribulations. It's not devastation if we're tested in life. Trials and tribulations are not a tragedy in and of themselves. It's in fact how we respond to it that's important. So it can be actually a means of getting us closer to Allah Ta'ala, increasing our psychological resiliency. And if we take that leap of faith that we believe in a good Lord, that if we accept His will and we trust in Him and have tawakkul, that our future will be in His hands and that we need to hand over control to Allah Ta'ala. Because Allah Ta'ala mentions, إِنَّ اللَّهَ إِذَا أَحَبَّ قَوْمًا ابْتَلَاهُمْ, that if Allah loves a group of individuals, He will try them. فَمَنْ رَضِيَ فَلَهُ الرِّضَى. And so whosoever becomes pleased with the will of Allah and the trials, then Allah Ta'ala will be happy with him. And وَمَنْ سَخَطَ فَلَهُ السَّخَطِ. And whosoever feels angry with this, and then they have earned the anger of Allah Ta'ala. Okay, so it's a trust that ibtila, that the trials and tribulations are actually maybe in our benefit. Ibtila in the Arabic language has positive connotations. Ibtila is not a bad word. It's actually a very positive. It means a cleansing. مَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُّصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُمْ وَيَعْفُ عَنْ كَثِيرٍ. That there may be a lot of trials and tribulations or difficulties that you face, and some of them maybe you've earned with your own hands. You've made poor decisions in life, and you've earned actually situations where you're in difficulty. But even that difficulty is khair, because Allah Ta'ala is forgiving you, is forgiving your sins through that process of going through that hardship. Another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, عَجَبًا لِأَمْرِ الْمُؤْمِنِ, amazing is the matter of the believer, إِنَّ أَمْرَهُ كُلَّهُ خَيْرٌ, that every matter of his is good. وَلَيْسَ ذَاكَ لِأَحَدٍ إِلَّا لِلْمُؤْمِنِ, and this isn't for anybody except for the believer. Why? Because you have to have belief, iman. You have to have a leap of faith and trust Allah. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُمْ سَرَّاءُ شَكَرَ فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ, and if a difficulty, if he endures a difficulty, if he endures actually good, sarra, then he is thankful and does shukr, and that's good for him. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ ضَرَّاءُ صَبَرَ فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ, and if he is inflicted with difficulties, then he has sabr, and that itself is good for him as well. In the Quran it says, إِنَّمَا يُوَفَّى الصَّابِرُونَ أَجْرَهُمْ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ, that the rewards of those who are people of sabr are without measure. That means that just sabban, tafsir mentioned, it just keeps flowing and flowing. That an individual will have their mizan, their weight, and then they'll put all of their deeds on it, and then it will be weighed, and then they will put sabr on top of it, and it will actually outweigh all of that. وَمَا أَصَابَكُم مِّن مُّصِيبَةٍ فَبِمَا كَسَبَتْ أَيْدِيكُمْ وَيَعْفُ عَن كَثِيرٍ, as I mentioned this. And tragedy is not bad. Again, tragedy is a matter of perspective. It's not in and of itself bad. ألا إن أشد الناس بلاء الأنبياء ثم الصالحون ثم الأمثل فالأمثل يبتلى الرجل على حسب دينه. That the people who are tried the most are the Anbiya, and they're the closest to Allah, then the pious after them, and then the most exemplary and the most exemplary after them. And an individual will be tried in accordance to their faith. فَإِنْ كَانَ فِي دِينِهِ صَلَابَةٌ زِيدَ فِي الْبَلَاءِ, and if he has increase of faith, then he will be more tried. So take trials and tribulations as a bushra, as a glad tidings that, alhamdulillah, that means that Allah is either forgiving me or he's showing me that I have great faith. وَإِنْ كَانَ فِي دِينِهِ رَقَّةٌ خُفِّفَ عَنْهُ, and if he has weakness in his faith, then he will be lessened in the trials and tribulations. وَلَا يَزَالُ الْبَلَاءُ بِالْمُؤْمِنِ حَتَّى يَمْشِي عَلَى الْأَرْضِ وَلَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ خَطِيئَةٌ. And a believer will continue to be tried until he walks the face of this planet and he doesn't have any more sins. He's just being forgiven and forgiven. So sacrifice actually builds resiliency. As I was saying, that if you do not endure or go through challenges and difficulties, then you will never be able to build resiliency. And Imam Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala talks about in the tarbiyah of children that you should give children good food one day and give them coarse bread the next day, because it actually allows them to build resiliency, so that if they endure or experience hunger later on in life, that they're not broken apart by it, and that they can endure it, and they don't feel frustration over it. So religious coping, through all of these mechanisms that I just mentioned, having a religious frame of mind and coping through religion and having positive self-talk, as Abu Zayd al-Balkhi in the 9th century in his Risala has outlined, the first actually psychotherapist, he's outlined that an individual should keep optimism and positive thoughts in his mind on store and available to him in times of need, just as he would in a medicine cabinet Tylenols and medications in the event that he's having a sickness, physical sickness. So ascribing a spiritual meaning to life actually increases positive mental health and decreases relapse after individuals have been discharged from mental health settings. As I mentioned, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi says that we should have this. And the awliya Allah, those individuals who are the friends of Allah, أَلَا إِنَّ أَوْلِيَاءَ اللَّهِ لَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, those individuals who experience grief and distress and suffering, in a different world, in a different way that we do. They don't experience suffering in the same way that we do. They have a greater amount of spiritual coping. Just as a disclaimer, I want to make a note that individuals might make the objection, are you saying that depression and anxiety is caused by solely and only by a lack of iman or spirituality? I'm not saying that at all. I think we need to keep into consideration that there are multiple variables that go into clinical depression and clinical anxiety, and there might be biological and genetic causes and chemical imbalances. But what I am saying is that there is definitely a connection between satisfaction, distress, grief, and depressive-like symptoms and sadness, and spirituality. That spirituality definitely produces more resiliency, but we're not taking an overly simplistic approach to say that it's the only answer, because the reality is that the Prophet ﷺ experienced distress, and so did Yaqub alayhi salam, for example, in losing Yusuf alayhi salam, and those were not individuals that, ma'adallah, that they experienced low states of iman. So self-talk, having these messages in your mind. So saying, for example, to oneself, I'm going to give up this job because it's haram, and hold tight to tawakkul, because I know that there is going to be some khair in it, that Allah Ta'ala will sustain my rizq. That there's not a creature on the face of earth that walks except that Allah Ta'ala takes care of its sustenance. That Allah Ta'ala has something better in store for me. Okay, so that's better. This saying, this tawakkul, is better than saying I'm just going to give it up because it's haram and being bitter about it. And I'm just going to hold on tight, and I'm bitter and I don't like it, and have resentment and anger. That doesn't help. Holding it in is not useful, but rather having a shift of thinking. Sabr is actually an active state of mind. We're actually thinking differently instead of just saying, I'm not going to be able to do this. In fact, Izz ibn Abd Salam talks about the stages of cognitive elevation in the Sharh of the benefits of trials and tribulations, which is actually a book I recommend that we actually read as therapists in our didactics. It's in our weekly seminars. And that is that sabr is wajib. So very minimally, you can't express displeasure, you can't do anything haram. But more better than that is rida bil qada, being content with whatever Allah wills. And that's mustahab. And even better than that is al-farhu biha, not just being content, but actually becoming happy when you have trials and tribulations. And even better than that is doing shukr. Why? Because you know that there's something better in store. You believe in a merciful God that has something better in store for you. It's either forgiveness or an elevation of status or something better in store for you in the akhirah or in the dunya. Just in the same way that, just as Izz ibn Abd Salam mentions, that a person will thank the doctor for amputating a limb of his because that limb had a cancerous substance that it would have spread and killed the entire body. So yeah, you're sad and distressed about losing the limb, but you're happy about the fact that you are saved from this fatal illness. Just running through a few gratitude research. So expressing gratitude, there's a lot of research on this. Shukr has short-term benefits on happiness, and individuals who are typically more grateful tend to be happier. So gratefulness research, so having shukr, having a positive, optimistic frame of mind. Individuals that did this, for example, before they go to sleep, they write down 3 things that went well during their day. They did this for a week. And what they did was they focused on, after each positive event, they wrote down why they think that this good thing happened to them. They found this focus on gratitude had a decrease in depression and increase in happiness 6 months after the week that they actually did it. And 60% of people carried on this task. So my suggestion is to do the following. Write down 3 to 5 things that you like and are grateful for, and do shukr, do muhasaba. Hasibu qabla an tuhasabu. Take account of yourselves before Allah Ta'ala takes account of you on Yawm al-Qiyamah. And write down one thing you didn't like and ask yourself, again, remember, positive framework. How do you think it might be a blessing in disguise? Come up with it. Come up with be creative. Think about the possibilities of how there might be hidden blessings in this. And for individuals who are pessimistic, this might be difficult. But you can try this as an exercise and try this every night before you go to bed. Appreciative inquiry. Shukr. As a goal, try to secretly serve someone each day. Individuals who do things for others and are selfless tend to be better off psychologically. Pick up trash along the road, for example, serve a family member, and do it secretly and write about it in your service diary. Keep a service diary of positive things. Just as Abu Uzayd al-Balkhi is saying, keep a positive store of positive thoughts. You're writing gratefulness in your diary. Have a section on service, positive service. Just like you would do exercise. I'm going to eat right. I'm going to eat this much throughout the day and count my calories. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to exercise this amount each day. Do the same thing with psychological well-being, gratitude, and spirituality. Focus on, I'm going to do this much dhikr each day. I'm going to do this much Quran. I'm going to show this much gratitude each day. I'm going to focus on positive thinking and optimism. And I'm going to focus on serving people. Okay? Give the easy sadaqah. Smile more. Individuals who smile more tend to feel better, are better liked, have better relationships. Savoring, focusing on the here and now. We always focus on the future, what we should get in the future, what we're going to get, and always investing in the future. I'm going to work hard so that I can get this material substance. I'm going to work hard so I can get this job. Focus day by day. Savoring is now part of this research. We are individuals that should keep a presence of mind in your food, in your conversations, in your occupation. Building tawakkul, I mentioned this. Building tawakkul and letting go of control and knowing that and allowing Allah Ta'ala to steer and be in cruise control so that Allah Ta'ala steers the ship. And we can come up with plans, but we have to keep our plans tentative. There's a saying in the Arabic language, "At-taqdeer yadhaku ala at-tadbir." That fate laughs in the face of plans. So we have to keep tentative plans, trusting that Allah Ta'ala is taking us towards a good end. And when we let go, we roll with fate. And this keeps life exciting. It makes life meaningful, not controlling everything, but allowing fate to steer us and having an element of surprise in our lives. And I'm going to close with this, is talking to Allah Ta'ala, having dua, having open lines of communication with Allah. Just as it says in the Quran, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي عَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ أُجِيبُ دَعْوَةَ الدَّاعِ إِذَا دَعَانِي فَلْيَسْتَجِيبُوا لِي وَلْيُؤْمِنُوا بِي لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْشُدُونَ. But if my servant asks of me, say to them, I am near. I answer the du'as of those people who call upon me, so that they should call upon me and believe in me, and perhaps they will be rightly guided. So being able to keep a presence of mind, being able to keep a connection with Allah Ta'ala, having dua, and having, there's a lot of research actually on spiritual people, even if they're not Muslim, on how they cope with a spiritual coping. I actually have a textbook on this. That's APA approved manual of spiritually integrated psychotherapy that talks about individuals who have spiritual ways of making meaning of their suffering. An individual who loses their child, they think, so for example, one individual had mentioned, there was a quote of an individual, I remember, something along the lines of the divine presence enveloping me. and almost like holding me in the divine presence as if somebody was holding me in their arms. And that allowed me to feel a sense of tranquility and sereneness and an ability to cope with the loss of my child. This is profound. And unfortunately, in our materialistic world, people don't have an appreciation of this. And this sixth sense, this spiritual sense and this experience, unfortunately, is dying among people. And I think it's important for us to be able to revive this, have a paradigm shift of working towards meaning and resiliency and positive living. And moving away from materialism that actually has in store for us a lot of psychological suffering. And we will close with this. I ask Allah Ta'ala to give us all satisfaction and meaningful existence and happiness, and that we meet Allah Ta'ala in a state that He's pleased with us, and that we are definitely in a state that He's pleased with us, and we are pleased with the outcome of our akhirah. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakumullahu khairan. If you have any additional questions, you can email me. My email is on the Khalil Center website. Please do visit us at khalilcenter.com, KHALIL center.com, for more information on future programs or to learn a little bit about our services. And we do have web therapy to help with individuals who might be struggling with certain things that are very specific and not so general. Jazakumullahu khairan wa barakallahu fikum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.